just to open, I just want to say, Jakob, how amazing it is to see what you have done here at Vanderbilt. We've known each other for a long time, and he has just been such an extraordinary catalyst in this field, and it's remarkable to see what you put together and also to hear of your vision and optimism. So thank you very much, and thanks for being here. Hello, Salman. Great to see you.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Suzanne.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you here this morning. We have a full room and a really distinguished conference down here in Nashville. So I'm going to kick it right off, and we're going to focus mostly on kind of free speech in our culture. And to begin with, Salman, there's been so much talk over the years about so-called cancel culture, but in the last year we've seen kind of a twist on it, which is the effort to cancel literary events and writers gathering, and we've experienced this at PEN America, a boycott campaign focused on the PEN World Voices Festival, which Salman launched when he was PEN America president and has stood the test of time as a very distinguished and unique international literary festival. And this year, writers protested it because of PEN America's stance and what we had said or not said about the war between Israel and Hamas. And the festival, for the first time in more than 20 years, did not take place. And it's not just limited to us. We're seeing it with literary awards. In Canada, we're seeing a protest against the Booker Prize. I'm wondering what you make of this trend and whether, in your mind, this can be kind of a constructive form of protest, and if not, sort of what are writers missing when they take part in this?
Well, obviously, there's first of all, I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished gathering, and I've been listening a little bit to the previous speakers, and it's clearly going to be an impressive day. Well, of course, what happened with the PEN World Voices Festival is a great loss for culture, and the question is whether that is less or more important than the issues being protested. And also, what is the benefit, what effect can such protests have? And my worry is that they have very little real world effect. That's to say, there is no reduction in the number of bombs falling in the Middle East or children dying because a literary festival is protested. So there's no practical gain, but there is a practical loss. And so, I'm opposed to it. It's not just happening in America. It's as you mentioned, in the UK, there were protests against many of the major literary festivals, the Hay Festival, the Edinburgh Festival, so on, because of their criticism of some of the people they were receiving sponsorship money from. And again, that led to reductions in what was possible in the cultural sphere, sponsors backing away from supporting the arts, from supporting literature, and considerable damage. So I think it's possible to arrange for voices to be heard without there being a boycott. So I wasn't at the National Book Awards last year, but I was told that there was a space created in which the protest activists, protesters, and writers could make the points they wanted to make without disrupting the flow of the event. So hopefully that can be more widely adopted.
Yeah, I guess the protesters would say it is the shutting down of the event that really makes the headlines. If they do kind of a quiet, modest protest on site, that's symbolic, it might feel good, but that there is some real potency to being able to stigmatize an organization, to spread the notion that perhaps any institution in the cultural sphere that traverses a red line, may be punished for it. And so, how do you sort of persuade that that power, which I think is real, is something that should be kind of forsworn or at least exercised with restraint?
Well, it's something very like the power of the mob, isn't it? I mean, it's what happened. I mean, I know a little bit about what happened with Pan America, and it wasn't just a kind of polite opposition. It was there was intimidation of writers, and people were kind of bullied to some degree into withdrawing from events that they might otherwise not have withdrawn from. So I don't like bullying, and I think this kind of protest very easily slides towards that. And I'd like somebody to tell me what benefit there has been of these, because I don't think there has been any.
From the institutional side, one thing I think we've witnessed, whether it's on campus or in the cultural world, is there is this powerful impulse to submit to the loudest voices. It becomes very painful to have this thundering criticism on social media and in the press. And oftentimes there may be a sort of a silent constituency that feels differently, that really doesn't like what's going on, that it objects to bullying. And yet, they're quiet. They don't want to mix it up. It can be punishing to enter into these debates. And so the institutional calculus, I think, is swayed by the most voluble and extreme. And I'm wondering what you think can be done about that. How does one sort of stiffen the institutional spine?
Well, first of all, I think you're quite right that this is not these protests don't represent everybody by any means. And I mean, I've been on the journalism faculty of NYU for the last 10 years. And my experience is that the students that I have interacted with are very reasonable, and they're willing to engage in what was just being talked about, civil discourse, and I haven't myself experienced from students the kind of extremism of these, as you say, loud voices. So if that's my experience, I suspect it's the experience of most people at NYU. I limit my discussion to that because that's what I currently know most about. And maybe we should listen to the silent people. It's perfectly possible to be aware of the fact that that many people studying in universities are perfectly reasonable, and don't like things being shut down and banned and cancelled. And if you scratch a little deeper, you might find that they have strong opinions about that.
Do you think there are any situations where academic and cultural boycott is justifiable?
I don't know, I mean, I remember even back in the days of South African apartheid, when there was an international call for a cultural boycott. I remember worrying about it because the people who would be impacted by a cultural boycott would be the people who were opposing the apartheid regime rather than supporting it. So it was a way, I thought, of damaging your own side. I could understand absolutely the reason in the South African context for a sporting boycott, because that hit the people who were the apartheid gang. That if you refused to play rugby football with them or cricket with them, that really hurt. But refusing to join a literary gathering made no impact at all. So I was even there where the ANC was calling for a cultural boycott. I wasn't sure that that was the right way to go. And I think certainly in non-fascist societies like this one, I think it's an error. It's an error of judgment.
I'm struck by, in certain contexts, kind of the difficulty people have making a distinction between, say, a writer, a novelist, an essayist, and their government. It seems like in some places it's kind of crystal clear that these are independent voices. And that's really the essence of pen. A pen is the idea that we're standing by these independent voices, by virtue of their independence and as a counterweight to government and the state. And yet in some contexts, there is sort of this conflation and this stigma that seems to attach to a whole society. We see it now. People don't want their books translated into Hebrew, let's say, because I guess the idea that the readers, are kind of complicit in a state that it is guilty of human rights abuses. So I'm curious sort of how you think about that distinction between the writer and the state and how it's perceived in the literary community.
Well, I remember back in the early 70s when I first became involved in this area, there was a term I very much liked that a British Indian writer coined this word. He said there are writers who try to be behalfies. They try to speak on other people's behalf. And he said one of the things that you should really try to avoid is being a behalfie. Because as you say, the beauty of literature is that it's one voice speaking in its own individual way, and nobody owns it. It's not owned by any movement or ideology. It's one individual's vision being presented freely for public enjoyment and discussion. And that's why we read books. We don't read books to be told what we already think. We read books to see the world through someone else's eyes. And so I worry when writers are thought to be representative, of some group or nation. I remember my dear friend Amos Oz used to, I think, suffer from the problem of being thought of as a national writer, whereas actually he saw himself as an individual creative spirit. So I just encourage people to think in that way, because it is the beauty of books, that they are not representative of gangs or ideologies or powers. They are individual voices speaking freely.
I want to shift gears a little bit to some of the tensions that we've been experiencing here in the United States. PEN America's gotten very involved in documenting and pushing back against book banning in school districts and libraries in parts of the country, which has become a kind of powerful wave that I never thought we'd see. One point that gets made in these debates over book banning is that, some of the books in question, it's all sorts of things. It's Toni Morrison, it's Art Spiegelman, it's Anne Frank, but it's also sort of edgier books about gender identity, books that can be quite explicit, books that have a very particular viewpoint, let's say, on issues of racial justice. And the pushback that I sometimes get is, don't these communities sort of have the right to pace the way in which these ideas are absorbed? Some of these ideas are new. They run counter to the mores of a particular constituency. They may offend religious sensibilities. And to have these just freely available in the library, in the classroom, is not something that necessarily should be sort of, as they put it, forced upon a community. And I wonder, do you have any sort of sympathy for that kind of argument?
In one word, no. I think the key to what you just said is the word freely. And if we're talking here about freedom, and part of that freedom is enshrined in the First Amendment. And it seems to me that the First Amendment covers our right to read, not just our right to speak. Schools, universities, libraries are exactly the place where you should come across ideas that you haven't previously come across, and that even ideas that you might not agree with. If they are to be policed, then who does the policing? That's the old question of who guards the guardians. And from what I see, the pressure to ban books in schools and libraries is coming from a very small section of the community, often from people who have not even read the books in question. Often very small numbers of people, like one person, one parent, objecting to a text which is then removed pending further discussion. This is not acceptable. And I think there are, I think is Penn involved in the First Amendment court case in Florida?
Yes, we are. We have brought our own case in Escambia County, Florida, where it's exactly what you said, which is a single individual getting more than 100 books withdrawn for a county with 20,000 students.
Yeah, I mean, I think, most reasonable people might agree that for one parent to be able to remove books from the reach of 20,000 people is anti-democratic.
I'm wondering, Salman, how you see sort of some of these trends that we're talking about, these very pitched debates over speech and content affecting how writers think, speak, what topics they take on. We all know that in a climate where the cost for certain speech can be high, where you could face a penalty, where it could affect your career, you could undergo online harassment, you might be tagged as racist or sexist or in some other way bigoted, that there can be an impulse to restraint and just to avoiding those topic areas. And I think over time, that kind of becomes internalized. And I'm wondering sort of if you see that, where you see that, and what you think can be done about it.
Well, I do worry a bit about young writers. I think when you get to my age, I'm just doing what I'm doing, and that's what I'm doing. But I think there are young writers who do suffer from the pressures you speak of. But what does one have the right to talk about? Whose subject is a given subject? And are you trespassing if you go into areas which you're not supposed to go into? What language can you use? What words are acceptable and what words are suddenly not acceptable? I do feel that there's a lot of pressure on young writers, and also a pressure on young writers to be very involved in social media. Writers are basically told by publishers that they have to have a social media presence and they have to build it up because for career reasons. And many writers are instinctively private people, and don't do very well by being constantly thrust into public arenas. And I think it's harder now for writers to be like that. And that's must be very worrying. I do think it's worrying. Self-censorship is, I think, a genuine worry, that people are alarmed about entering into areas which they think might get them in some kind of trouble. I hope it's not many people, but I think there are some people who do feel pressured in that way.
I want to follow up on your point about social media, because you had a big presence on Twitter. I remember we also had kind of a gratifying experience together in getting Roald Dahl's books when there was an effort to kind of denude his books and boulderize his books, in pushing back against that on social media. It's the only time I ever went viral, thanks to Salman. And the publisher actually reversed themselves in short order and continued to publish the books as originally written. But you've told me you recently have left social media kind of for all intents and purposes. And I'm curious about that evolution and that decision and what you think it says about speech in our discourse.
Well, I just decided that the thing that I still call Twitter is now it's like a room full of people you don't want to be in a room with. and so what I did was I have left my account active because I was told that if I deleted the account, it could be cyber squatted. And there could be somebody using my name who is not me. So I've left the account active, but I have happily deleted the app from everything I have, and it makes life much more peaceful and happy. I'm happy to say, and I recommend this move to everybody.
What do you think it would have been like, Salman, if you had published the Satanic Verses in the age of social media and cancel culture and all the sensitivities that we face today?
Well, I think about that, and there's no doubt it would have been more dangerous, because the speed with which information spreads now, and the rapidity with which a large number of people can be motivated, into a kind of mob response. That's infinitely greater now than it was. I mean, back in 1989, the most there were fax machines, and fax machines were used to disseminate propaganda against my work. But it would be exponentially more now. I mean, one thing that encourages me is just to take the case of that book of mine. It has remained in print all over the world. So I mean, it's published in, I don't know what, 40-something languages, and publishers have not been worried about doing that. It's remained in print for all this time. So I don't feel necessarily that it would be harder to get a book like that published now, but there would certainly be a lot more noise, and there might be a lot more danger. But even then, I mean, I learned a lesson back then just to give you one episode, there was a film that was made in Pakistan called International Guerrillas, of which I was the villain, and this team of people charged to murder me were the heroes. And when the film arrived in the UK, it had to get a certificate from the British Board of Film Classification, and it was refused a certificate because of its nature. And I found myself in this situation where I'm fighting a free speech battle and being defended by an act of censorship. And so I wrote to the board and gave up my rights of recourse. I said, if you give the film a certificate, I will take no action. I will not take any legal action or anything. And as a result of that, the film was given a certificate, and it was going to be premiered in the city of Bradford, which has a large Muslim population, in a big cinema, and nobody went to the movie. Why? Because rotten movie. Whatever people may have thought about me, they didn't want to spend their money going to see a terrible film. Whereas if that film had been banned, it would have become an unbelievably hot ticket. It would have become a taboo thing, which would have the glamour of taboo, and would have been much more widely viewed. As it was, it just withered and died. And it taught me the lesson of trusting the audience. That you can actually mostly rely on people to have good sense, and let 1,000 voices speak, and people will decide which ones they want to listen to.
When the Satanic Verses came out, there was this upsurge in the literary community in support of you, not uniformly, but it was kind of a proud moment that gets people harken back to it. Stephen King saying, if you remove Salman Rushdie, you can remove Stephen King from all of the bookstore shelves, and bookstore owners risking their lives in some cases to stand up for the book. Do you think, we have a different climate now when it comes to the question of offense? And I'm wondering whether you think the cultural world would stand up in that way.
Well, I hope so. I mean, as you say, it wasn't universal even back then. And I think it wouldn't be universal now, but I hope that there would still be a view that writers should not be killed for writing novels, and that they should be defended if somebody tries to do that. I think so. But I mean, I do think there's this idea that being offended is something that needs to be dealt with rather than ignored. It has more currency now. You know, I mean, I remember the British writer and comedian Stephen Fry, when he was asked about this question, he said, "Well, if you tell me you're offended by something I say, my answer is so what?" And the reason why there are many books in bookstores is that you don't have to read the ones you don't like. You can find the books you do like. So I think that's still a view that has currency, but there's no doubt that there's a view now amongst some people that if you are offended by something, you have the right to get it stopped. You know? And the problem with that argument is that, you know, all of us are offended by something. And if we all have the right to get things stopped that we don't like, that we are offended by, there will be no books to read. There will be no films to watch. It becomes the end of speech if offendedness is a limiting point. And if we remember, just going back a couple of hundred years, that when at the time of the French Enlightenment, those writers, you know, Montesquieu, Diderot, Voltaire, etc., they knew that at the time, the force that was placing a limiting point on thought was the church more than the state. And they understood that in order to create what we now think of as the idea of free speech, they had to defeat the power of the church to do that. And so they did that by using blasphemy as a weapon. I mean, by not allowing that to be a limiting point. You know, and the church, of course, then had all kinds of weapons. It had excommunication. It had you know, the index of banned books. It had something. It had the Inquisition. You know, and yet, as a result of I'm simplifying really, but largely as a result of the European Enlightenment, the church lost that power to limit thought. And that idea became the basis of the American idea, brought from France to America by Thomas Paine. So to prevent there being limiting points being placed on thought is a very important principle. And offendedness can't be can't be the thing that replaces Catholicism.
Well, let me just sort of pose what, you know, tension that we deal with a lot in our work, which is the lingering legacy of these very deep bigotries, you know, that manifested themselves in segregation and discrimination, but that still persists to this day in biases and negative perceptions and divisions, and sort of this sense that as a pluralistic society, you know, there's still a good deal that we have yet to overcome when it comes to racial equality, and that, you know, bigotry has to be confronted, and that certain kinds of speech or stereotyping that was normalized, you know, needs to be marginalized, and sort of how you know, whether you give credence to that, because it does tie into the concept of offense and sort of at least an awareness, maybe not banning that which is offensive, but being cognizant of that which is offensive, understanding the sensibilities, the history, how perceptions may differ. You know, I sometimes talk about it as being conscientious with language, and the idea that in a pluralistic society as citizens, I think we have some responsibility to do that. And I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a polite person. I don't like offending people, you know? So I don't do it on purpose. But what is true is that any strongly expressed vision of society will be unpopular in certain quarters. It just, you know, you can't please everyone, and it's certainly been my experience that I've managed to please a few people and I've managed to displease a few people. And I think that just goes with the territory. It's not, you don't set out to do it. It's just a consequence of expressing yourself. And I agree with the idea of courtesy and politeness and understanding what people think and how people respond to things, and what is a good way to talk to people and what is a bad way to talk to people. I think all of that is important, and I certainly, as a parent, would want my children to do that and to think that way. And I was taught to think that way by my parents. So yes, courtesy is really important. But if we're talking about works of art, the offense can be completely unintentional. Picasso's Guernica had to be protected. It was going to be destroyed by people who objected to it. And one of the reasons it spent so long at the Museum of Modern Art in New York is because it was not safe for it to be in Spain. There's a story that a Nazi officer, or I can't remember who it was actually, but an extreme right-wing person asked Picasso why he had painted such an offensive painting. And he said, "Why did you do this?" They said, then he answered, "I didn't do this, you did this." Because the painting is, of course, a depiction of an atrocity. So art has often offended people. The Impressionists offended large numbers of people when they first started showing their work. There was enormous objection to it, and now they're the cornerstone of any great modern art collection. So it's also a question of the time in which you do something. That a work can be offensive at one moment and inoffensive at another moment. And that's one reason for keeping it around, because times change, people's attitudes change. What was radical at one moment becomes normal at another moment. So this is the point of this whole subject of free speech, is about allowing work not only to be made, but to survive. And people like me write books with the hope that they will endure. And the only way they endure is to stay in print. There's no other way that a book can live. And so I think if one takes that long-term view, it's not just about what people think today. It's hopefully what will people think in 100 years? What will your grandchildren think about the thing that you don't like? Maybe your grandchildren will have no problem with it. And let it live so that they can make up their minds about that. So it's also a question of time, of duration. It's not just about the news cycle. It's about being allowed to express ideas and to make work in such a way that the future could look at it. Because actually writers historically have been the people who have defined a moment for the future generations. If we now think about, let's say, Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Russia, we would, I think, more or less immediately think about War and Peace. And Tolstoy, in a way, has given us the clearest vision of what happened there. And so that's what art can do. It's not just about what your neighbors think the day after tomorrow. It's about what does the future think, and the future should be allowed to make up its mind.
So in the last several years, one phenomenon that obviously is not new, because you've experienced it for decades, but it's intensified, is authoritarian countries reaching into free countries and democracies to menace dissident writers and activists. And it used to be that kind of more or less, if you could get into exile, you might be giving up a lot in terms of political potency within your country, but you're relatively safe. And now what we see, this incident, the diplomatic blow-up between India and Canada this week, other incidents that I know we'll talk about at this conference. We have Masih Alinejad here. And I'm wondering what you think this means for writers and for an organization like PEN that is in the business of trying to allow writers, even in the most repressive environments around the world, to carry out their work and feel that there is a support network and somebody will stand by them?
Well, it's true that there are some countries that try to reach across borders to murder people and have done so. It's still a relatively small group. I mean, I think I was very shocked that India should think about assassination in another country. That certainly is something that calls itself the world's largest democracy should not do. I mean, we know that Iran has done this. And on the whole, I still think there are safe spaces that can be created for writers. I mean, I was involved in the creation of this network, which is called ICOR, International Cities of Refuge Network, where quite a lot of cities around the world have now agreed to provide accommodation and safe spaces for writers who need it. And so it's still possible. You know, was it Joyce who said that what writers need is silence, exile, and cunning? And well, I hope that still works.
Yeah, no, I hope so too. And it's also it's reaching into the free societies and then also menacing oftentimes family members back home and you know, applying pressure in new ways that I think sort of do raise the price. I'm wondering what you think in terms of the cultural world and kind of, you know, you've confronted radical Islam, you know, throughout the decades, and sort of how you think about how that phenomenon is looked at and has been looked at in different periods. Is that, you know, is this something that kind of happens in waves? Is it like other forms of
what religious
radicalism?
Fanaticism you mean? Well, you know, religion, unfortunately, is always with us. And every so often, it acquires extreme characteristics. You know, we were talking about the Enlightenment, but I mean, now, there certainly is something I never expected to happen in my lifetime, which is a return of religious power to, if you like, to the center of the conversation. You know, I mean, when I was at university, we were talking about the Vietnam War and feminism and civil rights, and the subject of religion never came up. You know, it wasn't part of the conversation. And now, you know, evangelical Christianity in this country, radical Islam around the world, extremist definitions of Hinduism in India, you know, wherever one looks, there's a kind of revival of extreme religious ideas. And to someone like me, who, to put it mildly, doesn't suffer from religion, it's first of all, it's surprising. I didn't expect it. And secondly, it's something that needs to be, you know, sometimes you feel we have to refight battles that we thought we'd won. I thought the battle for free speech in the West, at any rate, was a battle we'd won. You know, and now here we are having to fight it again. I thought the defeat of the power of religion to limit speech was also a battle that we'd won. But it now seems we may have to fight that again. So there we are. History goes in circles, cycles, spirals, perhaps, spiraling downwards at the moment.
Well, just we have to close in a minute, but I guess I'll ask you, you know, as you think about girding up for some of the battles, old and new, you know, what to you is the most important source of strength and power kind of in the movement that I think all those in this room are part of in defense of free speech? Like, where do you see the kind of source of inspiration that can guide us as we enter into these battles anew?
Well, I guess the answer to that is where we started, which is look on the shelves of a library, look on the shelves of a bookshop, look at the ideas that are there, and the power and the beauty of living in a world in which so much can be said in so many different ways. You know, the actual effect of freedom is beautiful. You know, and the complexity, the multiplicity, the plurality of a society which is a free society and an open society is a beautiful thing, and it's worth fighting for.
Thank you so much, Salman. Really wonderful to have you.
Thank you. I'm great to be with you all. Thank you.